Just finished the first turn of 1099, and a couple of changes. The Turks, Kerboga ended up taking Aleppo in a siege. I've moved Bohemond and the Sicilian Normans back over there after the Crusaders bribed the Armenians. The Armenians have about 10 guys that they've added to that army, so that gives them about 25 ASPs to Kerboga's 23 or 24, so about even. I kind of made a mistake with Kerboga, and instead of just putting a little intrinsic garrison in there, I moved him into the city. And Bohemond joined up with the Armenians quicker and got his activation card first and ran over there and laid siege to the city. However, you'll notice it's not under siege now because Kerboga sortied his men, got a flank formation against an impetuous charge by the Crusaders, which gave him a +5 on his combat roll, which helped them out. They ended up with a +11, so they got a 5 to 15% ratio there, so that broke the siege. Although they're still in the city as part of the sortying force, but the city's no longer under siege, so Bohemond will have to try and lay siege to it again on the next turn, try and reclaim it. Baldwin's force up here did end up taking Samosata from the Turks, so now the Turks don't have any cities. All they have left is a town up here, and they ended up getting the Muslim recruitment card, so I had to put some of their reinforcements in the town, and then others in the Mosul Turk box, which I think is where they're supposed to go if the Turks don't have any cities that weren't under siege. Aleppo was under siege at the time, so I couldn't place any recruits there. Otherwise, kind of unchanged up here. The Crusaders will try and get Aleppo back. The Crusader fleet card finally showed up, so they've got some fleets now that I've moved down here towards Acre. And also the Fatimids finally showed up. I had the option of either making the Fatimid army larger or activating the Fatimid army and moving it, or activating the Fatimid fleet and moving it. So I opted to activate the army, but couldn't really run them over to Jerusalem to try and break the Crusader armies there, because by the time I drew the Fatimid card, Raymond and Robert of Flanders had already joined their armies together at the gates of Jerusalem. So, well, they weren't joined at the time. They're joined now at the start of this new turn. I've made Robert of Flanders the overall commander in the space. But there were 2 stacks there, and the armies can't attack together if they're not joined in the army assignment phase, which is at the start of the turn. But if they're in the same space together, they will defend together. So at this point, the Fatimid army, which is only about 25 guys strong, would not have been nearly strong enough to try and challenge the Crusader armies that were stacked there at Jerusalem. So looks like the Crusaders may get Jerusalem after all, if they can get through that SDR before the game ends without Muslim forces trying to break the siege. Now, as far as the North Syrians go, and I didn't really look this up in the rules, but they didn't have any cities left, and you can't recruit if you don't have a city. It doesn't say anything about being able to recruit in towns. So what I ended up doing was ceding Beirut from the South Syrians to the North Syrians, so the North Syrians can have a city to recruit from, to give them a sort of fighting chance to kind of make more of a game of it. So they've recruited, I think, 6 or 8 ASPs so far. So if they can get a few more, they might be able to run out and cause some trouble before the end of the game. We're only about 4 turns away now. So that's where things stand. We'll take a look at the next turn. Well, things are moving a little faster, so I didn't do a recap of the June to mid-July turn, or of the mid-April to May turn. I just finished the June to mid-July turn. Just a couple more changes. As you can see, Kerboga chased away Bohemond from Aleppo. The Turks, or the Muslims, played a Armenians Revolt card, which sent all the Armenians that were with Bohemond home, and then Kerboga was activated right after that, and ran out with his now much larger army, and chased off Bohemond back into the hills, although the Bohemond retreated to that 3 point there, and then the Christians played a terrain advantage card and decided to make a stand there, which affected Kerboga's die roll. I think he was at his formation roll was poor, and so he ended up with a -3, I think, and then the terrain advantage, or he ended up with a -2, and the terrain advantage gave him an extra -3 for a -5, so he ended up taking some pretty substantial losses in that fight, and ended up retreating himself back to Aleppo, where he did some recruiting the last turn, as Bohemond has tried to regather forces to make another attempt to try and lay siege to Aleppo before the game ends. Although Kerboga also had Balduk run out back to the Mosul Turk box and pick up some more recruits there, so Kerboga's got his army back up to 17 or 18 now, I think. Although Bohemond was at, I think, 11, 9, or might have been like 9 or 10 guys left in his army, but he's bolstered it with some more Armenians, and then I've got Baldwin on his way out here with another 10 guys to augment Bohemond's army. So he might have enough of a force left there to try and make a siege of Aleppo and get those points back from the Muslims before the end of the game. Although with only 2 turns left, it's looking pretty much like it's going to be a pretty solid Crusader victory. The only city that the Muslims really have a chance of hanging on to is Aleppo. That'll net them 5 points. But the Crusaders are going to get 8 from Edessa. They're going to get 15 from Antioch, a couple from Hama, a couple from Homs, big 10 points from Damascus, and it looks like they're going to get Jerusalem here too. The Fatimids I've not been able to draw another card to reactivate the Fatimids. And again, their army there with 20 guys, or 25 guys, just not big enough to do any damage to the Crusader army outside Jerusalem, which is doing a partial siege, as you can see, which means that even if the Fatimids try and relieve the South Syrians in Jerusalem, because it's a partial siege, the Crusaders can fight with their entire army against that relief force, which is currently it's about 40 guys in that entire army. So just not really any chance there for the Fatimids to have much impact on preventing the fall of Jerusalem. As you can see, they've got the, whatever that is, Budimids, whatever, siege equipment basically, that gives them +1 to an assault. So right now they're at +2 because they don't quite have 3 times as many forces as the South Syrians do in there. So I think they're at a +2 in the assaults with the siege equipment, and then just having more ASPs. So next turn, Jerusalem should fall. It's an SDR of 5. It's already got 4 assault points on it. So, yeah, the Crusaders are going to take Jerusalem before the end of the game. And, I mean, ultimately they didn't even really need to, as it's pretty clear that they've won here. The Muslims, and there is one other siege here in Beirut. The North Syrians are under siege and blockade. Got another Crusader ship in there. Are being blockaded and sieged. They'll be starved out by the end of the next turn, probably. So, but all the victory point cities except for Aleppo at this point, and there will be in the hands of the Crusaders by the end of the game, which means it's going to be pretty decisive. So I'll work my way through these last 2 turns and then kind of do a little summary of the game. But this video will definitely be shorter than the other one. Alright, I just finished the penultimate turn of the game, mid-July to August, 1099, and just a quick recap on this turn. The turns are going pretty quick now, especially with the majority of the North Syrians and South Syrians leaders all bottled up in Jerusalem and Beirut, respectively. So there's not a whole lot of movement for the Muslims. It's just drawing activation cards and passing on them. Still no more movement for the Fatimids. I have not gotten a activation card for them. But what I did get on this turn was each side got a leader ill card. So that prevented Robert of Flanders from performing any assaults on Jerusalem this turn. So they'll just have to sit this turn out and do siege attrition, which isn't going to be enough to make the city fall this turn. There's still too many Syrian ASPs in there, so it'll be on the last turn of the game. Roberts will probably get 2 assaults to try and take Jerusalem on the last turn of the game, and we'll see if they manage to do it. The Muslims also got a Leader Ill card, which they played, or the Crusaders also got one, which they played on Karboga, keeping him bottled up in Aleppo. He did, however, have an activation for Balduk, who he sent out to pick up some more ASPs. And then the Turks also got some reinforcements. They got the Muslim reinforcements card this turn and added another 6 or 7 ASPs to Karboga and Aleppo. So he's kind of rebuilt his army. Plus, with what Balduk has, he could have, I think, up to almost as many as 30 ASPs. But Bohemond has about that many sitting in Brayek there if he can keep the Armenians on his side. But I think for the last turn, I don't really plan on trying to take Aleppo back from Karboga. I think I may just have Bohemond stay right where he is, parked outside, parked between Karboga and Edessa. As it is, unless Karboga were able to make it to Edessa, get another activation, initiate the siege, and then on his second card activation, stage a successful assault that kills the 1 ASP defending Edessa, there's no way they'd be able to take the city on the last turn. So, again, pretty much a Crusader victory here. We'll just see how complete it is and whether or not they can get Jerusalem here in the last turn. And that's the end of the game. I was wrong, actually, about Karboga being able to take Edessa with a quick assault. It's actually 3 SDR, and there's no way you can get you'd have to get an 8 on a 6-sided die roll or was it 8 or 9? Let's see here. It was, okay, so he would have had to have get an 8 on a 6-sided die roll, but the most he could get is a +1, because he gets a +2 because he has 3 times the defender's strength, the intrinsic garrison of 1, but he subtracts 1 because the city wasn't under siege. I didn't want to take the extra activation to put it under siege, so I just went for the assault, but then realized, oh, there's 3 SDRs. There's no way that I could do. You have to roll an 8 to do 3 SDR damage in an assault, and there's just no way I could get an 8 with the city not being under siege. So he didn't actually have a chance to take it. So I assaulted anyway, and he took a point off of it, but not enough to get it on the last turn. I just left Bowman where he was. I didn't even end up moving him. I'm actually not sure why there isn't a marker on Samosata. The Germans captured that, and maybe I accidentally moved it with the Germans. I don't really know what I was doing, but anyway, Samosata was captured. I did move Balduk down to try and just a last-ditch attempt to take Tarsus. That was one of the Mosul Turks' victory cities. Aleppo was as well, so they get 5 points for Aleppo, but none of the other Muslim factions had any victory points. I did get on about the last card draw of the game, activated the Fatimid army, which was, they were sitting in Ascalon. I moved them over and did a last-ditch, what the hell, assault on Nablus. And there I rolled 7 and got 2 assault points, which was all it took to take the city, so they ended up taking Nablus on the last turn, which sort of isolates the Crusader armies down here in Jerusalem now, with Nablus being no longer in Crusader hands. The closest city to them that's Crusader controlled is Acre, and then to a lesser extent Damascus, way over there. And I did mess up that last turn when I did my last recap on the penultimate turn. I forgot to do siege attrition for the 2 cities that were under siege. So, as it turns out, the siege attrition was enough to kill the remaining Muslim armies in both cities. So, Beirut fell to the Germans. So I had Godfrey run off and drive the Emir of Tripoli back a little further south. And then the Crusaders actually ended up taking Jerusalem. I rolled like an 11 or something for the Muslims in siege attrition, and that killed off the remaining 4 ASPs that they had in their army there. So the Crusaders did actually take Jerusalem before the last turn, and occupied it on the last turn where they possessed the True Cross. So they got 25 points for Jerusalem, another 10 for Damascus. I think 5 for Acre, so that would be 30. And then 33 for Homs, 36 for Hama, another 15 for Antioch, which makes it, 51? No, 50, 51 points. They don't have Aleppo, and they had Edessa. That would make 59 points. And I think Edessa was the last victory point city, so just a pretty convincing win for the Crusaders. As I mentioned before, my strategy with the Muslims was not good. I should not have really spent time trying to go after armies, and I did this with the Crusaders too. I would try and go after I did try and go after Muslim cities, but I also went after their armies where I could, or tried to block their armies. And with the Muslims, I tried to go after the Crusader armies because I thought, well, let's shave off as many ASPs as we can, and they'll just run out of guys before they can get to Jerusalem. But as I learned, the Muslim armies just do not fight well against the Crusader armies. Those knights are just, they add too much or subtract too much to the die rolls, depending on who's rolling. So it's difficult for the Muslims to really inflict that ASP damage, at least not at they can, but it's at the expense of their own armies. And if they have no armies left, they don't have any way to defend these cities, or more importantly, as I found out, not defend the cities, which was my mistake to begin with. I shouldn't have been defending the cities. I should have just let the Crusaders take them, step out of the way, wait for the Crusaders to move on further south, and then step back in to reclaim all the cities that the Crusaders keep taking. That's really the strategy that I should have focused on with the Syrians in particular. The Turks can run around and harass while the Syrians focus on taking cities. I just didn't do that. And it showed. The Syrians were just effectively eliminated as a fighting force, and just could never rebuild an army back up to anything substantial enough to cause problems for the Crusaders. So, lesson learned for the next game. And I don't know how the Second and Third Crusade fighting capabilities will do. There's kind of a whole different rule set for the Second and Third Crusade scenarios. It's almost like those were for a different game. Those are all done with chit draws as opposed to this card activation scenario. So like the game was designed with the First Crusade in mind, and it was like, oh, well, I guess we need to do some other other scenarios for this instead of just one First Crusade scenario. So they came up with the Second and Third Crusade scenarios. So at some point I'll get to those, but I plan on taking a little break from this for a while. I did enjoy it. It was very different than Kingdom of Heaven in a lot of ways. Kingdom of Heaven felt much more like a CDG. This felt less like a CDG, even though I had these cards to use, and I was doing the card activation method for the different factions. It never felt like a CDG where I was ever pondering a hand of cards. These cards really come into play. Most of them are immediate play, and the ones that do come into play are very, very specific in their instances where you can employ them. So, card plays did come in and were a factor at certain points in the game, but nowhere near the level of what they are in a typical CDG. So, ultimately I didn't feel like I was playing a CDG, although it also felt like it moved really fast for a Berg game. There didn't feel to me to be a lot of exceptions or too much chrome. There was some chrome in there, but not the kind that ends up having me constantly check the rule book, which I feel like I did do in Berg games more frequently. And certainly comparing it to the Ancient World series, like I did initially, a lot less rulebook checking than I had in the Ancient World series. But the Ancient World series, combat and movement with the whole continuation idea and the whole way that cities and defense and sieges and things work, none of that ever seemed very complex to me. And the complex part of the Ancient World series to me was particularly the Roman leadership rules, and then just the activation, knowing how many chits to put in the cup and things like that, managing those sort of mechanical processes of the Ancient World. Here, with this card activation, felt very different to me, somehow less annoying than the calculating the number of chit activations in Ancient World, even though I had to do this thing where I'd have to sort all the cards out at the beginning of every turn, so I could have the pot of cards to choose from for each faction, and then have to buy them. After a while, that just went really quick, and I didn't have to look up rules or anything. It was just fairly intuitive and simple to just lay all the cards out and say, okay, here's how many points I have to buy cards this turn. So I actually kind of liked the card activation by the end of the game, even though it added that little extra bit that I have to do at the start of every turn of fumbling around with the cards. So overall, less of a burdensome rule set, I think, than Ancient World. By the end of the game, I was really kind of flying through the turns, just because, and part of that's maybe because I'm playing solo and kind of knew what I wanted to do with everybody. I can imagine if you're playing a full 7-player game of this scenario, it's going to take a lot longer because you're going to have people doing more wheeling and dealing in the diplomacy phase. I just didn't do a whole lot of diplomacy here. I just played it straight up almost as a United Muslim faction versus United Crusader faction. And when you're playing a 7-player game, that can go all over the place. You can have Crusaders fighting each other. You can have Muslims fighting each other. You can have Muslims not cooperating. Here I ended up gifting a city to the North Syrians, which they promptly lost. That was Beirut. Just so they would have a place to recruit since all their other cities had been destroyed. Well, if you're playing a 7-player game of that, in that case, maybe the Northern Syrian faction is just eliminated from the game. That player is just eliminated because nobody will help him out. They might or they might not. If they don't, he's essentially eliminated. He has no way to recruit a new army because he has no cities. So I can see the 7-player variant of this, or the 7-player full version of this, playing much, much differently than how I played. Nonetheless, very enjoyable. The First Crusade is just such a fascinating historical period. Just how the Crusaders managed to take Jerusalem against the long odds that they faced is pretty incredible. And so it's always interesting to see how that plays out. Here it played out much easier, I think, than what historically happened. I mean, most of the Crusaders historically spent most of the game, or what would be the game, in Antioch, and by the time they were done there, it's amazing they even had an army left at all that somehow got all the way down to Jerusalem, which is not really close to Antioch, and when you're talking about medieval era travel. So just pretty incredible. Overall, enjoyed it, and maybe I will get back to the Second and Third Crusade sometime in the future. When I do, I will do videos of those also.